in mind, we're going to imagine that students have got a question on social class and education. There are abundance of different studies that you can use, from the contemporary to the classics, and some which sort of cross and bridge over a range of different topics. So should we start with some classics? Okay, what classic studies do you think students could really apply to this question?
Combination of things, but if we start with the classics, I think, when I close my eyes and I think about my own A-level experience of sociology, and then obviously going to continue at university, I'm fortunate enough to sort of study sociology of education at university as well, as a master's. I think those names always stay with you, and I think that's Bowles and Gintis, and the sort of the correspondence principle or theory. You've got Willis and learning to labour, still sort of those studies there. You've got Parsons' idea of meritocracy. Obviously inadvertently you could be looking at Davis Moore and role allocation as well, because obviously that's sort of the counter argument to social class. There's those sort of names that stick around. I know that I've missed out some of those names, and I'm thinking like Bourdieu and Bernstein, but I sort of put them under a different umbrella. So you've got this sort of these classics that you might have studied sociology in the 1970s, and then you studied sociology in the 1990s, which is what I did. And then the students are studying now, and they're still there in a lot of the textbooks. So I don't know about yourself, Matt. Are they sort of familiar names to you when you were a student?
Yeah, definitely, without a doubt. No, I think there's a couple that students always seem to remember. The Paul Willis study is kind of really is a classic. Definitely one that I would get students to use, because a lot of the language that's used in there as well, Willis talks about fatalism, this idea that they already think they're going to fail. Fatalism is quite a nice word to include. And so, yeah, I think the Willis one. And then I just wanted to pick up on the Bowles and Gintis one, because I think a lot of students struggle with that one a little bit. So how do you introduce what the correspondence principle is? How do you explain it to them?
Yeah, good question. I tend to sort of put that alongside of Davis and Moore, actually. So I think it's really important early on, because I think, particularly more with GCSE sociology, because obviously they've got names in that as well at that level. But definitely in the first year A-level course, students can get 2-3 months into a course, particularly if you're doing education first, not that there's a right way of doing it and ordering things, is actually think that Bowles and Gintis quite like the correspondence principle. So I think it's really important to sort of earmark straight off that, you've got these two ideas. They both believe that education sort of prepares people for work, and obviously looking at the sort of class divide, but they look at that very differently. And I think one way that I sort of get students to think about it is really making it practical to them. So obviously highlighting that sort of concept and thinking about how schools achieve that, and using their own real life examples. And students can list off loads of examples. They sort of then go on to a sort of mini rant sometimes about, school uniform or the hierarchy or whatever that might be. But I think a really good starting point is setting it out very clear that you've got this, this role allocation, which is obviously the functionist idea from Davis and Moore, and then you've obviously got the sort of correspondence principle, and really sort of setting that stand out for those students very early on, saying, look, they're very similar, but they're very different, the outcomes are different. And they're really applying it, I think, with all the theories where possible, without making it sort of too sensitive for the students. It's applying it to their own real life experiences within the education structure. I'm not saying that's the right way to do it, but that's how I do it with my students. So yeah.
Yeah, I've seen quite a lot of teachers deliver it where they have what it's like at school down on the left-hand side, and the students have to fill in the corresponding on the right. So the teacher's like the boss, and getting merit points is like a little bit of a pay rise. I think that works quite well, doesn't it? So I think what's really important there as well is you've mentioned when you're applying classics that you have got a bit of functionalism and Marxism in there. I think there's a tendency for students to see a question on social class and be very narrow-minded, tunnel vision, that there must only be Marxism, but you can draw from other sources, can't you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's really important as well to use real life examples when they hear it. I mean, there's so much at the moment out there in regards to social class. I think as much as the classics are really important, I think it's important to stay abreast of what's going on in the news. Obviously, with the cost of living, you can't escape that I mentioned earlier. Obviously, the work of Marcus Rashford and what he's doing. I think it's really good to put those in contemporary examples. I think for students, I think it's really important for sociology to feel very much within them rather than out there, and I think for them that makes a bit more sense to them. So yes, use your studies. Well, I'm not suggesting that's right, yes, use your studies, use your classics, but also thinking about what's going on, maybe looking also at the policies as well. I think for me, sociology is one big melting pot of everything, and where you can draw links between lots of different things. So think, I've got a question on social class, but what policies are helping reduce it, or are they making the problem worse, maybe by sort of stigmatizing students or not, and thinking about marketisation as well, that sort of comes into a social. I think, if I was thinking about social class, I think you've got to really think about what's contributing to that in education. Is it just the studies and, the in and out school factors, or is it also thinking about the policies and marketisation of schooling as well, and obviously breaking down sort of the material, cultural, teacher-student relationships, subculture. So it's one big melting pot, really, in that. And I think those sort of key connections are really important for those students to make.
Yeah, it's a good point. In fact, I think some students could be overwhelmed because, there is so much that you could use. You just mentioned the contemporary. If students were using contemporary examples, which contemporary studies would you sort of urge them to use? What are kind of ones that you really like yourself?
I mean, this is just my bias, and there's two. I put like a sort of a disclaimer again. I was lucky enough to be taught by Deborah Udell, so hence the reason why I sort of use her. She was in my MA, and I love the work of Louise Archer. I'm a super fan of her work. I've listened to on your podcast, and I've been lucky enough as well to interview her myself. For my own students. So I love both their work. I think it's nice to have the students, to have people who are actively doing research that are not people that are outdated, so it means something to them. So I like Gilborn and Udell. The only thing I would be careful of is obviously their work is around free school meals, so sort of linked to social class, obviously is an indicator of social class, but obviously ethnicity as well. So I think it's really, really important that the students are aware of that, because sometimes I think some students start off talking about social class and then it turns into a bit of an ethnicity essay, and then don't draw out the social class bit. And I think they've also got to be careful not to make the assumptions that all ethnic minorities are there for, low income families. It's looking at the sort of the back picture behind that, and why some ethnic minorities are more likely to be have lower incomes, and drawing the sort of institutional racism potentially as a link. Obviously Louise Archer and her Nike identities, I think that's something I'm personally interested in. I did actually my dissertation around that, so that's why I was like to use her. And then Diane Ray, and I like the way she sort of draws upon marketisation of schooling. It's very contemporary with reference to free schools and how free schools have and sort of marketisation has polarised the working class students, and how middle class parents are able to navigate their way through that a little bit easier. So I think they're sort of ones that are my current go-to.
Yeah, and thank you for doing a bit of plugging there. So I've been lucky enough to interview both Louise Archer and Diane Ray. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, please do go back and listen to them. Diane Ray gives a fantastic rant as to why she thinks private schools should be abolished. So definitely a good one for social class. I think that's also really important what you said about staying on what the question's asking you. I've noticed, for example, I mentioned Paul Willis earlier. A lot of students start with Paul Willis and then start drifting into why it's a problem for boys. But if it is a question about social class, you've got to be really careful to stick focus to what the question's actually asking you, don't you?
Oh, 100%. I think that's a common thing. And remember, we were talking about a notional 16, 17, 18-year-old student who, will easily sort of lose thread. So it's just sort of reminding that, and that's part of all your sort of hour as practitioners of sociology, as teachers, to sort of remind students that, like, going back over there, saying, what point did you sort of drift off onto gender or ethnicity when the question was about class? And also making not sweeping statements as well, which is, all statements, or, every, those sort of quotes that students may answer. So I think, lots of contemporary stuff out there. And I think that's an important balance to the sort of classics as well, because I want to show the students it's still relevant, that it's not something that's, something that was studied sort of over 100 years ago that might not be relevant in nowadays. It's actually probably more relevant now than it probably has been for a long time.
Absolutely. We then have what I think you refer to as value for money studies, the sort of studies that cross over lots of different topics. The terms, the terminology, the keywords can be used to other topics away from just education. So if students are feeling slightly overwhelmed that there's just too much to learn, these are really sort of good key studies, aren't they, that can apply. So what's your value for money studies then, Katie?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I sort of pitch at the beginning of the course, but also remind students throughout the course that they'll notice there's a pattern, maybe not in their first unit, whatever they study, that's going to be the first time they encounter them. But there's certain sociology issues, whether you're looking at beliefs, whether you're looking at cultural identity, whether you're looking at, education in this context we're talking about, or you're talking about crime, there's certain names that you could just sort of use again, because sometimes they're not talking about that. Do you know what I mean? So like, especially if they were writing in, I don't know, 1960s or something like that, they're not actually directly talking about marketisation of education, because that wasn't around then, but their concepts can be used and applied to understand that. So my value for money with sociologists is out there. I just think, you know, ideological state of affairs particularly is very appropriate for lots of different topics. And I think once the students understand that concept in the education unit, they can sort of use that again within, say, beliefs or cultural identity, or other units, particularly maybe in media as well. You've got Becker and his concept of labelling. Again, straight off, I'm thinking at the top of my head, yes, education, but obviously crime and culture and identity. Bourdieu, his work obviously around culture capital and culture deprivation and habitus, obviously again can be used in lots of different topics. So I think knowing who your sort of value for money sociologists are, you know, I think Sue Sharp is one of those as well. I think once you've got them under your belt, I think the students go, oh, they're cropping up again. I think the key thing is being mindful they might not be exactly talking about that because that thing didn't exist, but their concepts could be used to apply to understand something in greater detail. And I think for students, like you said, they can get a bit overwhelmed with the amount of concepts and theories and studies, and especially when you've got the plot twists of like, oh, by the way, there's feminisms and there's, you know, of structuration theory and all the other ones that go in, and you sort of think neo-Marxist or whatever. So I think if the students can feel like there are some sort of core sociologists they can use more than once in more than one topic, I think that gives them a sense of comfort. And I think sometimes as well, I think it's sociology is one of those things that weirdly, and I don't know if you feel the same, Matt, but I think weirdly gets easier as it goes on. I think it feels like a bit of a baptism of fire in the first term, and the students are like, whoa, there's a lot here. But I think as they go on, they're like seeing, obviously, the same theories are being used, some of the same concepts, some of the same names. Sometimes they use the policies again in different topics. And I think sometimes they're like, oh, actually, it's not as difficult. And I think when you get that synoptic element at the end, when they draw it all together, particularly when you're sort of looking at the theories question in the sort of theories and methods question, you say to students they can use anything that they've learned in order to understand that question. I think actually, unlike some subjects where you just learn that and you don't use it again, you learn that, you don't use it again, you learn that, I actually think that sociology is the opposite, and I think it gets easier as it goes on. And I think, you know, you might get harder sort of in a debate sense, because you maybe feel a bit grayer about how you felt about things in like your first year, but actually from a knowledge base, I think in some ways it's easier because you're just building upon existing knowledge, and revisit a lot of things again and again. So get those value for money sociologists out.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of like scaffolding, we call it, don't you? Keep on building on it. I mean, if, for example, the final topic that you do is crime, you could already list and name a number of different reasons why crime rates are high among certain groups before you've even studied it. So, yeah, I definitely agree. A few other questions for you, if you don't mind, Katie.
Okay.
I have a lot of students who are pushing and they want to get to the A star. Okay. Now, of course, for your essay to stand out, it's got to be a little bit different. You know, there's going to be a lot of students around the country who are writing the same things, talking about the same sociologists. So what is distinctive about an A star student? What are they writing about? What sort of concepts and theories? What makes it stand out from the pack?
I think for me, I think it's not been. Actually, it's funny enough, I had this conversation literally with my students the other day. I get the stage wrong, so I don't know idioms that well, because I'm mixed ethnicity. I always get them the wrong way around. But basically, I think it's called grab the ball by its horns. I think it is, yeah. So I think when students like literally take command of the essay and they are driving the essay rather than the essay driving them. So they are looking at those nuances between the theories and the concepts and seeing similarities and differences. And so I think sometimes students who you feel maybe haven't made those synoptic links are just writing a very sort of what I say is a pedestrian way. So this theory says this concept says, evaluate it. It will just go along, and you sort of it feels like they know it, but do they understand it? Whereas I think a student that is an A-star student or an A-grade student is answering the question and are looking at the how far argument a bit more, and are seeing sort of like limitations, and they might be putting counterbalance arguments, so evaluating the evaluation. And I think that's when you feel like the students really made those synoptic links. I think that's the difference between a student and maybe a BC grade student that sort of, maybe they go back to education and know all the in and out of school factors, and they can list them, they can explain them, they can evaluate them. I think an A-star student will be someone that can see, well, how far is it in school? How far is it in outside the school debate? And actually, it's not necessarily knowing more. It's not knowing more. It's knowing that in a lot more detail and a lot more depth, rather than just listing a lot of concepts and theories. It's doing something with them. And making those, like it says, it's making those conclusions all the way through, and looking at it analytically all the way through. But yeah, someone that's in charge of their essay a little bit more. I mean, what do you think, Matt? I'm so used to being on the other receiving end of asking questions, so it's interesting for me to be the one. What's your opinion on that?
I agree. Yeah, I've done quite a lot of examining myself, and unfortunately, you do get a lot of essays that look very structured, almost like the students planned it out in their head before they knew what the question was. Okay, so if I get social class, I'm going to write this, but they haven't looked specifically at what the wording of the question is. I think trying to use some sociologists that aren't just the obvious ones, I think does go a long way. And like you said, linking it to contemporary ideas. So if you could link a sociologist to the cost of living crisis and Marcus Rashford's work, that is really standing out, and it's had a lot of thought being put into it as well. I do think a bit of fancy language goes a long way,
bit of Bernstein's elaborated codes there.
Yeah, absolutely. Just because the way I think of the word flow, if you look at it, flows from one paragraph to the next, it's continually evaluating and considering all the way through, rather than just blocks of paragraph that look like they've just been plonked onto the page that have been learnt by rote. So a nice flow to the essay, and also making sure that there is this sort of overall evaluation at the end. Quite often you're reading through a paragraph and all of a sudden there's a full stop, and you have a look and you go, oh, that's the end of the essay.
At the end,
yeah, exactly. Drawing to some sort of conclusion that goes back to what the original question's asking, I think, is really important. Yeah,
definitely. And I like to see a bit of postmodernism if it was an essay about class. Yeah. I think often we go straight to Marxism, like you said, and then maybe functionalism. I wouldn't mind seeing some sort of intersectionality there as well, from the Marxist feminists potentially. And I think it's like you said, linked to those sort of contemporary examples as well. So I think, like you said, a bit of a flow, a bit of a flair, definitely. And I think sort of feeling like you're reading something that's tipping into starting ready for their undergraduate level, if that's what they choose to do. I think what we're seeing is a move away from the idea where you're just remembering content to shoehorn into an exam question that can be. I think you're starting to see more the need within it with questions, and for the students to have those critical thinking skills a lot more. I think there's a less of the case of, if I remember going back to seeing an out school factors, so sorry to hate on them, but like the example, I remember 3 of them and 3 of them. That's not enough anymore. I think there is that need to sort of look at them a lot more in a more complex way. I think you can't just go in and it's not a memory exam.
I've got another question as well, because this is one that comes up quite a lot. Whenever there's a question about social class, lots of people turn to Marx, and you open an essay and it says Marxists such as Marx believe that, and then they go on to an explanation about Marx. Where do you stand on where students should use Marx in an essay of this nature?
I think, like I said earlier, I think if there's better names that are actually talking about education. So I think, leave Marx for the open with the people. Yeah. Basically. I mean, I think sometimes, if students can use different Marxists, that would be better. And obviously, go back to your question earlier about sort of those students working at the higher end, is knowing the difference between maybe sort of neo-Marxists or sort of like the debate. I think sometimes students get confused between the bourgeoisie and like the working classes, and sort of interchange concepts. But I mean, Karl Marx, obviously important names, but I think there's more appropriate names that students need to, or not even names, sort of concepts they need to be exploring. Maybe I think sometimes we get bogged down on the names, and then it ends up becoming like a who's who of who talks about what, but actually knowing the concepts would be more important, and the application of that as well. So there's AO2 and AO3 skills.
I'd also say to students to be really careful what the question's asking, because sometimes it might say specifically about underperformance in education today or in the contemporary society. So I quite often think students miss that contemporary society today, and making sure they focus on there. Okay,
Yeah.
if we start to round this up, any other top tips? So we've said use some of the classics if they're appropriate. Good contemporary studies out there. You've got quite a lot of synoptic names as well. Is there any other top tips you would give if students were to get an essay on social class and education?
Oh, good question. I think read the question. I think it's going back to what you just said. I think sometimes the students, we're all, again, like I said, notional student wants to shoehorn things in that might not necessarily work. And also, like you've just said about Karl Marx, was he really talking about, marketization of education
Yeah.
or Alpha Z? So I think again, making sure that those names they're not saying that. So, how are you applying their concepts across? And also, I think be careful of not drifting, like I said already, into an essay maybe about gender or ethnicity, if that study is also looking at those as well as social class. And I think for the students, I think sometimes it's just to breathe. I think if we think about exam conditions, I think the sort of that environment when it goes, now turn over the page and you hear that noise of all the papers go, I think sometimes it's just taking that time to breathe and looking at the question and going, well, what is it actually asking me to do? Because sometimes there's two parts to that question, isn't there? So it might be looking about in-school factors and social policy, or it might be looking at in-school factors and subcultures. So I think, be careful to read the question and answer the questions in front of you. That would be my top tip.
Yeah.
I did the mistake when I was a student. I read a question. It was all about countries, and I read counties. So
Yeah.
there we go.
Yeah.
It's a geography exam at GCSE. So luckily it was a mock.
Yes, I think to go back to something I said earlier, I think some people see perhaps the word social class, for example, and then go, right, that's it, get marks down, let's get marks and down. But they haven't specifically looked at what it's actually asking, certainly. And I think sometimes, like you said, to spend that time to look through the paper, because quite often if there's an item, for example, the item will give you a lot of hints. It's got sociologists in there, it's got statistics in there, it wants you to apply it, it wants you to refer it. So yeah, open the paper, breathe, have a look through, make sure
Definitely read that item.
Definitely read that item, make sure you know exactly what it is actually asking as well. Katie, there might be some students thinking, right, where else can I get some more resources from? So do you want to do a bit of plugging? If students want to find some more resources, some good videos.
You're too kind.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, obviously my other hat on is obviously Tutors to Use. There's loads of stuff over there, and a lot of it is free, to be fair. We're doing a weekly revision blast for A-level sociology on a Wednesday. We're having a little break while we go on the tour for the grade booster. If you haven't got yourself a ticket for that, please join us. But lots of free stuff. There's loads of videos on there that Craig has done. There's loads of downloadable bits on there, and obviously the free revision blasts on a Wednesday. So come and join us for a bit of revision, and hopefully see some of the students there as well. But thank you for your time, Matt. Lovely talking about sociology with a fellow sociology enthusiast.
Yeah, I hope to come and join you at one of your workshops soon as well. So thanks again, Katie, for giving up your time.
Definitely. You too. Take care. Look after yourself and have a good day. Bye.
Bye now.